Welcome to Confessions of a Cyberpsychologist. Today, I am chatting with Rebecca McKeown about the psychology of online crisis resilience, especially in the area of cybersecurity. Beck is a chartered psychologist and an expert in human science and the director of Mind Science, Clear Thinking for a Complex World. Welcome, Beck. I'm so delighted to have you on board.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Really looking forward to the conversation.
Beck, before we get into chatting about the work you do, can you tell me a little more about who you are, what you do, and what the pivot point was that sent you down the road of cyberpsychology?
Okay, cyberpsychology is an interesting point, and a lot of conversations I have go along the same route is that it was all a happy accident or a series of happy accidents. I'm not sure I actually know of any cyberpsychologists that went there on purpose, but maybe that's an age thing, who knows. Anyway, I started my journey in psychology back in the early 2000s when I jacked in my job and went off to do a master's degree at Cranfield University. That was in applied psychology. And my original intention was to go off and do behaviour change, organisational change management type stuff. But Cranfield was very much at the time an aviation specialist university, and I discovered human factors in aviation, and that completely blew my mind as being a thing. I didn't realise that that was an area of study, and I just found it utterly fascinating, because who doesn't like getting on a plane to go on holiday, and then to find out all of the behind the scenes stuff was quite exciting. It happened that Cranfield specialised in accident investigation, so I learned an awful lot about not just the way that airlines set up how to evacuate from an aircraft, but also the way that people behave in that situation, and therefore how best do you issue instructions to get out of the cabin and all of that sort of thing. So that was kind of where my interest started in why people behave the way they do in difficult situations. I did that for a few years, and then there was somebody went off sick in the military section of the human factors group. So it was like, Bet, can you go and do this particular piece of research with the military? So that was completely novel, not had anything to do with military. And I found myself at the British Army Training Unit in Suffield in Canada, living on an army base in the middle of nowhere. So here we have yet another fascinating experience. But this time round, people working in difficult situations is very, very different, because we're now talking about war fighting. That was utterly fascinating, and I ended up working in military research for about 10 years. So that sort of taught me an awful lot about how people are trained to work in difficult situations, the sort of skills that they need, why they behave the way they do, and how they make mistakes. And so this is sort of, again, you can see where I'm going with this now. So we started with the aviation, we did the military stuff. Then in 2014, I moved from the Bedford campus of Cranfield to go and work at the Defence Academy, which is a military base in Shrivenham, which is near Swindon. And I worked on the Cybersecurity Masters programme. So there then in comes cybersecurity into the skill set. And alongside that, I was also working with special forces, and we were looking at the psychology of how you build relationships with people that you don't get on with, all of this sort of thing. So it was just yet more fodder, I guess, to look at the difficult situations thing from yet more difficult angles. And the cybersecurity aspect I found quite fascinating, because whilst I know nothing about IT, I kind of got to understand that cybersecurity isn't just for IT people, it's for all of us, and we all have a responsibility, and actually we all have to safeguard ourselves in some sort of way. And that, I think, is where the sort of seeds of the thought of everything that I'd learnt over all those years in aviation and military, I started to see actually there's room for that in the cybersecurity sector. So when I left Cranfield in 2019, that's sort of been my, I know what I'm going to do. I've got this wealth of experience and knowledge, and there's a sector that's, I think, is crying out for it, because psychology and cybersecurity tends to be very much around what's the attackers, what's the hacker mindset, that type of thing, or cybersecurity awareness, and why don't people take any notice of training. And I think that there's still more to go in terms of defending the defenders, if you like, and what's it like to work in these situations. So yeah, that's kind of how I got to where I am now. And cybersecurity, it was just a series of happy accidents, and cybersecurity was the most recent one, I guess.
And you've just spoken about having worked extensively in the defense and security sector. So, how did you transition into focusing on the psychology or human behavior side of cybersecurity?
I guess it was that point of realization when I started working on the masters in cybersecurity and was looking at the human aspect. But when you look out into industry, all I see about cybersecurity is gadgets, tech. What's the latest tech? And everything is about tech and moving forward. And there's very little about, well, what about the people that operate the tech? Um, why aren't we looking at those a little bit more? So I just thought there is a gap here. I have the skills to fill it, and I'm sort of kind of on a mission really. And I think it's exciting because it's a new area, and a lot of people don't really realise how their brains work, how that impacts on the way that they behave, why people make mistakes, how they build relationships, decision making, problem solving. I mean, it's all there, but for some reason, it's just not really that well known about yet. So that's kind of why I just think that's the exciting bit for me, is about bringing something new to a sector that's ready for it.
I had an interview with John Blythe a little while ago, and one of the things he said is that a lot of companies, when there's a security breach, blame the person and talk about the person being the weakest link. Do you
Yeah.
find that actually we need to change the way we think about that, especially at the corporate level, to be more about equipping the human rather than blaming the human?
Yeah, and I think I mean, I know John quite well, and we've had lots of conversations on this topic. Um, it's tempting to blame somebody because it's easier to put the blame on one person to look at the organisational factors that may have led to that. Um, and there's the other thing about blame itself, and there's a saying that, if was it oh, something about catching more flies with you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. So when you think about that, if you're blaming the human and you're constantly saying it's the human being that's the problem, they're the ones that make all the mistakes, they cause all of the problems, you're completely and utterly alienating what is actually probably your strongest defense, which is the human being, because they spot things that technology can't necessarily do. So I think that that's very much, it's a cultural issue that has to be addressed really, because I think while people still work in a blame environment, all they're going to do is to hide any mistakes they make, or any mistakes that happen because of the way that the system is set up that it allows that to happen. Whereas if people are encouraged to sort of bring these things to the surface and they're rewarded for highlighting them, at least you know what's going on in your organisation rather than everybody hiding it. What I can't It's beyond me as to why people just have, this blame culture perpetuates. Although I think it is more. I was at a conference a couple of days ago, and somebody from a tech organisation had sort of said, well, we like to say that the human is the weakest link, but actually they're also your strongest link. So I think that the message is getting out there now, she says, hopefully.
How does your expertise as a psychologist contribute to improving crisis response capabilities in cybersecurity teams?
I think with me, it's, as I said a little bit earlier, having all of this knowledge about what working in a crisis does to the brain, how it makes you feel, because that does impact on your behaviour, whether we like to say we have feelings or we don't. And what I find is when people actually learn how the brain works, they're quite fascinated because they have no idea of all of the things that the brain is up to that we don't know anything about. And once you start to highlight that and highlight how you can work with that, it makes your life less stressful, you make less mistakes, you feel better about that, it builds your resilience. There's so many benefits to it. And I think that being able to take that experience and explain to people why, if they do these sort of things, you can make your own life better, they genuinely are quite open to it. So it's having all of that knowledge and thinking, well, actually, let's help people feel better, do better, and be less stressed.
So, what do you think the unique challenges are that you address in your work with cybersecurity teams?
I think it's an interesting one, and people say to me a lot, "Oh, what is it about cybersecurity that's so special?" And in some ways, it's it doesn't matter what sector you work in because people are the same. Our brains work in the same ways. We'll have different views on things and different experiences, but the brain is the same no matter which skull it's in. But I do think that cyber is unique because it's the whole hybrid space thing. So you've got that interconnection of digital and physical environments, and that creates a very, very complex landscape. And that to me is where I see a lot of links between military and cyber, because it's that level of complexity. Now, on the surface, having a war and working in cybersecurity might be quite different, but underneath that complexity is very, very similar. So to me, that's what I think is quite unique challenge for cybersecurity. And I'm not sure that the industry appreciates that there are a whole bunch of decision making, problem thinking skills that they could enhance to help them with working in that level of complexity.
It's an interesting analogy of a war and cybersecurity and how similar they could be. And you mentioned that cybersecurity is a VUCA, which is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment.
Yeah.
How does VUCA impact human performance during cyber crisis?
I think about this quite a bit actually, and I think um, VUCA is everything the brain hates. Let me explain. The brain is it's a limited capacity information processor is one way of looking at it, and because there is so much information to process, the brain uses shortcuts. So that's where bias comes from. I say unconscious bias, heuristics. It's all about the shortcuts the brain uses in order to work with the huge amount of information um, that it has to deal with. And you think VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and adaptive. Well, biases, I think there's probably about 180 of them roughly, depending on which information you look at. Anyway, there's an awful lot of them, but they're roughly split down into 4 categories. So that's biases in ambiguity, speedy decision making, information overload, and then memory biases. So that encapsulates everything that VUCA is. It's very changeable, it's very ambiguous, we don't know what's going on, we don't know what's coming next, we haven't got the experience necessarily to draw on to deal with that sort of thing. It's very complex, there's no easy answers. So the whole environment is everything that the brain actually hates. So there is the need to understand how the brain works and how to work with those things and what skills to develop to make sure that actually your life isn't crazy and full of mistakes, because that's kind of what the environment is going to throw at you. So hey, let's be prepared to deal with that challenge.
And that's especially important in a corporate or business environment when there's so much sensitive data and there's so much money at stake and so many
Yeah.
security breaches that could impact financially the bottom line of the business.
Well, I think it's financially the bottom line, but also it's the operational side of things, because the longer it takes you to identify what's going on and to put the remediations in place. But actually, if you're affecting the operation of the business, that's not just the business bottom line we're talking about here. If you think about the NHS attack last summer and all of those people whose surgery were delayed, that's impacting on people's lives health wise, and not to mention the stress around that sort of thing. So actually it's way beyond just the bottom line. I think, and it's interesting. I had a conversation a couple of days ago with somebody about cybersecurity, and we were saying that it's not just about the organisation. There's actually societal impacts, and I think when you see something like an NHS attack and hospitals can't function, you start to understand that the impact isn't. It's far bigger than we perhaps think about when we talk about cybersecurity in industry. But another conversation I've had was actually that cybersecurity, everybody's a cybersecurity company, whether you're Tesco, you're the NHS, Vodafone maybe. It's just huge, isn't it? It's quite overwhelming when I start to think about it.
That's a really great way to put it, that every company is a cybersecurity company.
Yeah, because whether you're a financial institution, so that's people's money, NHS, people's lives. Um, I remember I was up in York quite a few years ago, and there was a massive flood, and everything went down. So the mobile phone masts were down, banking was down. You couldn't get money out of the cash point. So to be in York, away from home, unable to call anybody, unable to access anything other than cash. And of course, the cash points that were working were very soon emptied. And that just highlighted to me how reliant we are on technology for everything. So But it's only when you experience something like that that perhaps the importance of cybersecurity tends to creep up your list of things I need to worry about.
How do you help teams develop the skills needed to navigate effectively under pressure in the VUCA cybersecurity environment?
Um, for me, that's something else that I learned when I was working at Cranfield and training people in these sort of um, skill acquisition. It's not what you learn, it's how you learn it. And this is massively important, I think, because sending people on traditional training courses is fine for certain types of things, but not so much for others. And I did some research on mandatory training for the military, for the Ministry of Defence, and we reviewed their mandatory training. And what we found is that if it's about information and facts and figures, then that sort of traditional classroom training is a knowledge exchange, then that works very well. But when you've got anything that deals with opinion and the way people feel about things, traditional training absolutely does not cut it. Um, I don't know if you've seen, there's been a thing doing the rounds on social media for quite some time now, and it's the characters from Toy Story. And there's an outcut of one of the film, and it's the pig. He's sitting there pressing a button, going like this really, really quickly. And it's a meme from mandatory training. Just going to get through it as quickly as I can. Tick the most legal sounding box. It'll be fine. I'll pass. But no, nobody's learning anything from that. And what we found was that learning takes place is when you're having conversations with people, your peer group, but also a diverse audience. And I find this very much in the training and education stuff that I do with the Ministry of Defence. We've got some senior leader training going on, but bringing people from outside of military, from police, fire, MOD civil servants, the conversation that's where the learning happens, because you're talking with people on the same level, but who've got very diverse range of backgrounds and experience. So that, to me, it's recreating that sort of level of environment in a series of short training. I prefer to call it CPD really, because it isn't kind of training per se. So what I tend to find is that you come together, you have these conversations, you have some materials that back up that, because you need to learn the stuff, but you don't need to learn that in the one-to-ones. It's the conversations. Go away, put it into practice, and then the bit that everybody hates, reflect on that, because that is where the learning happens. Then you come back in the next time, we sort of look back and what did you learn? How did you put it into practice? What worked well for you? What didn't work well? And then you learn a bit more and you carry on and you go off and you put it into practice. And so it's a continual learning loop, really. And that is the best way to learn. And I think it's also, that's where it helps with tailoring it for individual organisations, because what fits one organisation won't fit another. So if you're teaching people the underlying principles and working with them to develop those, they then apply it within their own situation. So in psychology, we call it transfer of training. So what you haven't got is the thing where you go on a training course, forget what happened, 6 months later you start to use it and it's all gone out of your head. You're just continually, part of your day-to-day work is to do that learning and embedding it in your own day job. So therefore it's tailored, but you kind of tailor it yourself. I did a course once with some special forces guys, and one of them came up to me at the end of the session. He said, it's kind of like stealth learning, isn't it, really? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I'm learning stuff, but I don't know that I'm learning it. It's just kind of happening. And I just thought, yeah, I like that. So yeah, stealth learning.
Nice. I like that. Because it is, I remember when I was a corporate having to do mandatory training, and it was just like, okay, just get through this so I can tick the box.
Yeah, yeah.
And
And I'm only doing it because I've had 6 emails from my line manager saying you're going to get told off if you don't do it.
exactly, and especially with cybersecurity, it's one of those things that you kind of have to do mandatory at the beginning
Yeah,
of when you get employed, and then you kind of think, well, why do I need to do it again? Surely it's the same information, and I got it. I've got to change my
yeah,
password every however often, and that's it. I'm done. But yeah, so to having that constant level of training, I think is really important, especially with
yeah.
so many new threats coming up and different ways of being attacked and all that fun stuff. Yeah,
Funny if you're not working in cybersecurity.
exactly. So you talk about the concept of mental agility. Can you tell me why it's crucial for cybersecurity professionals?
Yeah, well, it goes back to that sort of, the thing about the blurred lines between online and real life and the whole complexity because it's global as well, and you don't know exactly what's going on. And you speak to anybody who works for a large organisation in cybersecurity and ask them what the state of their assets are at any one particular time, and they will probably, I don't really know, because how can you know? If you've got 10,000 employees, you can't be 100% sure of each asset that those employees are dealing with. Um, and I think because of the novelty of threats as well, it could be something that you're very familiar with, phishing, for example, or it could be something completely new that you've never heard of before. And what I've seen when I speak to cybersecurity teams is that sometimes you also get lots of false positives with the the equipment that you're using to monitor your network. So, sometimes you can just ignore things because it's just that particular system, another false positive, when actually it might be something else. So it's about knowing when to stick to the playbook and to follow intuition, but also knowing when to move away from that and to start questioning it. And it's a very fine line, particularly when you're busy. Um, there's one really good example that always pops into my mind, and it's not a cybersecurity one, but everybody remembers when Captain Sullenberger landed his aircraft on the Hudson River. And that's exactly the same principle. There is a playbook for what happens when you have bird strike in an aircraft. That playbook was never going to work in those circumstances. That would have led to a complete and utter disaster. So what he did, he looked at the underlying things. Well, what do I need? I need an area that's a certain width, it's long, it's got to be flat. I'm over the most contested airspace on the globe, New York. So what am I looking for? So what he was looking for was that flat space where he could land, and the river, that was it, because there was no other choice. So what he knew was to actually sticking to the playbook is never going to work in this circumstance. I'm going to look for something that's going to fulfill my requirements and just go for it. And all ended very happily. And yeah, we all know that, we all saw the film afterwards. So that's the kind of mental agility, is the knowledge to understand what your strengths are, what you know, what you don't know, where your gaps in information are, and to be able to think, actually, now is the time. I haven't got what I need to look at it somewhat differently. So it's about teaching people, and there are a number of methods to do that and various different frameworks that you can use. So it's about learning how to do that agile thinking and also battle against those biases that make you want to just go forward and solve the problem quickly. So yeah, it's quite complex, but I think it's hard, but it can be quite rewarding as well. And I think it's something that it's not just about work. We use our brains at home. We have relationships at home with friends, family, and you'd be surprised at how much learning these sort of skills can actually change your outlook on life in general.
Cybersecurity and working in a cybersecurity team is already a very high stressful scenario. But can you tell me what some of the common decision-making pitfalls you've observed in cybersecurity teams during high stress scenarios?
I think what it is, I mean, there's many things that we can all do. We can all sort of take the first piece of evidence that you've got and then make all your decisions based on that. I was talking about an example of this the other day, and it was saying that somebody had working in a SOC team they'd had a range of phishing attacks coming in, and it becoming almost an everyday thing. So when the threat comes in, they just kind of assumed there's probably just another phishing attack, and actually it was a 0-day vulnerability for something else. But making that assumption, every decision that they made about what came next was based on that initial piece of information being incorrect. So that's a common decision-making pitfall, but it's common because it's the way our brains work, not because we're not very good at decision making or problem solving. So again, it's the biggest pitfall to me is not understanding the way your brain operates. So you're not prepared for what it's going to do when you're under pressure. So you don't necessarily know to look out for the cues. In military, we call it left of bang. So what happened before it all kicked off? Because if you do that during your review, you start to recognise cues in yourself, in the environment, in the people around you that are giving you a little warning, like say something's happening. So it's about the reflecting on what happened to learn what those precursors are and start to recognise them going forward. That answers the question.
Yes, yes, it did. It's a really good example of how sometimes you, like you saying, the left of bang, you actually think you think that you have a bias and
Yeah.
you operate in a specific way, and then don't realize that actually the bias is counteracting your original bias.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so,
it is really complex, and it is
yeah,
hard to say that, you know, it's not all rainbow unicorns scattering glitter over pink fluffy clouds, unfortunately. Um, but I know from developing the material for all of the training and the learning, you know, the courses that I do for MOD, it has completely and utterly changed the way that I see the world and the way that I analyse information, and that's been, well, it's been a transformative experience for me personally, I guess, which is where the passion comes from, to think, actually, do you know what? There's something in this stuff.
so going on to the work you do, how in a practical application of all this knowledge, how do you tailor your expertise to address the specific challenges faced by different organizations in the world of cybersecurity?
Yeah, I don't do the tailoring because what I'm teaching people is underlying aspects of the way the brain works, the psyche. I'm teaching them psychology basically, and then they go away and integrate that into their life. So that's the tailoring that it happens because it's like you can't train somebody for every eventuality, and anybody in cybersecurity will tell you you can't train for every single threat vector that's going to be coming in within your particular context. That's just not possible. So if you can't train for every eventuality, let's train for any eventuality, because if you've got that agility in thinking, the ability to build relationships and respond to that sort of dynamic way that the cybersecurity world works, then you've got what you need anyway. And it's just a case of understanding how it works in your environment. But then the benefit of that is if you move to a different job, you don't need to retrain. You're taking those skills with you, so it doesn't matter where you work and what you do. Once you've got that agile thinking, the agile people skills, and you can work in a team in the same way, you're set.
Which brings me on to my next question. Is you're currently developing a training workshop called the Agile Cyber Crisis Response Program.
Yeah.
So, what does this workshop or program address in businesses and amongst individuals and teams?
It's pretty much everything that I've been talking about, really, sort of split into four overarching modules. So the first one is about having an adaptive mindset. So understanding yourself, what makes you tick, what your strengths are, understanding how you deal with stress and cope with that sort of thing, and how to become an agile thinker. So that's the first one, is looking at yourself and thinking, well, actually, how do I work? Because if you understand how you work, you know where you need support, you know where your strengths are, but then it also helps you to understand how other people work, which is also very important. So that's the first module. The second one is very much based on cognitive psychology. So it's about critical analysis, critical thinking and reasoning. And that thing that I was talking about was understanding how to change thinking styles when you need to. The third module is all about people, and it's my absolute favourite one, because this is the stuff that all came from when I was sort of teaching special forces, how to win friends and influence people. So it's understanding how you work, but understanding also how other people work, and then you know what skills to leverage in which different situations to actually be able to, I say, to work with people you don't like. Let's say to work with people that are different to you, because one thing that is absolutely essential in VUCA is this idea of diversity of thought. And when you say diversity, people generally tend to think equality and diversity, protected characteristics, etc., etc. And it is about that, but it's also about a whole lot more, which is diversity of thought. So there's a whole piece around that, and how to get on with people that are not like you. And then the final one is about working as teams, because we don't work in a vacuum. So you put all of those skills together. What do high performing teams do that other teams don't? And it's all about collaboration and understanding each other, and having the same understanding of the work that you're doing. Shared mental models, we call it. So what I hope to achieve by that is, it's a set of building blocks, really, and then by the time you get to the team thing, at least then you're qualified in your psychology of how you work, how other people work, and how it brings it all together.
So, how long is the workshop, and what type of key takeaways will participants learn?
It's not a workshop because you can't do these sort of things in a workshop. As I explained a little bit earlier with the way people learn, it's about going and learning some principles and putting them into practice. I'm working on two different versions of it. So one will be an online version with little hour-long chunks of learning that you can do at whatever pace suits you. There is a bigger one which would be sort of like an afternoon of workshop based on one of the topics, and then you go away, fill in your workbook, and you do um, the putting it all into practice, and then come back and we have another in-person session. So it depends on the organisation, how many people they want to do. But I think we certainly, if you're building high performing teams, to have that coming together to talk about the issues that you experience as a team is very important. So that's why there is an online version as well as the in-person version. I'm currently building an evaluation tool with a colleague of mine, and so what we hope to be able to do is be able to take an assessment to start off with, and then you will know where your strengths and development needs are, do the program, retake the assessment at the end of it, and you'll be able to see hopefully some difference. So there's a lot going on at the moment.
So is this currently available, or is it still to be launched into the big wide world? And if either way, how can businesses sign up for it?
It's launching into the big wide world probably at the end of March. I'm hoping I've got an event at the end of February where I'm hoping to do some piloting of various different parts of it. And then for sort of end of March launch. And the best way would be to just get in touch with me on LinkedIn, and I can provide you with details. But obviously, I'll be talking about it on LinkedIn nearer the time. But yeah, there's a lot of background work going on at the moment.
Oh, wow, it does sound like a lot of work, but
Yeah,
really,
it feels a bit overwhelming at the minute, but we're getting there. So
yeah, but really needed, desperately needed.
I think so. It's I don't know. I don't know. It's an interesting one because wherever I go, and ever I do talks, whether it's at a conference or I run workshops for organisations, everybody is utterly fascinated. And the feedback that I've been getting is actually there isn't really anything like this out there, and I think we need it. So hopefully, fingers crossed, this is going to be the year.
Yeah, this is the year. Okay, so moving on to another thing that you've recently contributed to is the fourth annual World Economic Forum Global Cybersecurity Outlook 2025 report. That's quite a mouthful, and it sounds super amazing. So, what was your involvement, and what are the top line learnings in the report?
My input was really I was interviewed by the team that created the report because they were looking at complexity as the overall topic for the report. So for me, it was very much about the sort of the conversation we've had about what it's like to work in a VUCA environment and the sort of skills needed around that. So my input, I think, was really about the sort of what is it around psychology and complexity. And I think one of the things that they identified was this skills gap in cybersecurity. I'm not sure when you talk in cybersecurity about the skills gap, it tends to be people saying, well, actually, we can recruit people who haven't necessarily got all of these cybersecurity ticks in boxes and qualifications. I'm not sure that the conversations around the psychology, the soft skills gap, is high enough up at the agenda. If you look in the report, I think the skills gap thing is bothering about 7% of CISOs, and I just thinking I think there's something missing here because you're thinking of a skills gap in terms of cybersecurity certifications. It's way more than that.
I think that's the key, is that most people see cybersecurity as the practical element of what procedures do you have in place, what certification do you have, what
Yes.
software do you use, all that stuff, rather than seeing the human behavior side of it and how are we actually understanding how we behave. Because once we know why we behave in doing something, we can do something about it.
Yeah, exactly that. Exactly that.
So, Bex, we're coming to the end of the standard interview questions and the end of the podcast. But so I wanted to go into the three standard questions I normally ask all my guests. And the first is, what is the most important question I haven't asked you yet?
Um, why don't people value psychology and human factors in cybersecurity? And I don't think this isn't just in cybersecurity. I think it's an all-round thing. I think that the discipline of psychology, we probably haven't done ourselves many favours, because the amount of people that I know that work in cybersecurity, and they've been leaders and they go out and they're quite happy to talk about leadership skills and all the rest of it without not really understanding there is a whole discipline behind where all of these leadership theories come from. So, and it's a scientific discipline. I've got 2 psychology degrees. They're both science degrees. This is not an art, you know. It's evidence based and all of the rest of it. So I think that for me it's the question that's been niggling away at me for the whole 20 years that I've been working as a psychologist, and nothing's changed. So I obviously don't have the answer. Yeah, anyway, so that's I think when I was thinking about what do I answer to that question, is what's the biggest gripe or the biggest niggle that's been niggling away at me, and that's the lack of appreciation of the science that is behind psychology and the sheer volume of knowledge and scientific based evidence that is there, and yet everybody thinks they can just do it because, hey, I'm a human being, I've done the job, so therefore I am, you know.
Do you think also part of it is that doing a cybersecurity course or having the correct apps that help you with your cybersecurity is much easier to measure than human behavior and the human factors? And you
100%.
and you can't tick the boxes about actually they have this specific bias, or during this crisis they think this way, because it's just so much harder to measure.
Yes, I think that is a large thing of it, and it's interesting because I've during the military training research that I did, we were very much looking at that, and I think that the way that we base learning and development is based on theories from the 1950s. It's behaviorism, you know, a training course. You measure something, you go on a training course, you measure again, and the difference between them tells you if you learned something. That's so old fashioned. And going back to, I think, was it the 70s, where sort of constructivism as a principle came in, is that we construct knowledge, we don't just learn it, we have to integrate it within current knowledge, and that's how we learn to use it. Um, and actually, why is it that something, I mean, even the 70s was donkeys years ago now. I mean, God, I was born in the 60s, I know how old I am. So why are we still clinging on to this perception of training and development and learning that was based in the 1950s? Because we certainly are not reliant on 1950s technology to get by. So why are we still banging back on about, I need to see proof of learning by a tick in a box that says I know something? Because learning isn't just about levels of knowledge, it's about the way that you're motivated to learn it, it's about feelings, it's about affective domain, you know, how we engage with it. And yet here we are. If it's not a number, it doesn't count.
And also, as we were saying before, sometimes you're just going through the training just to tick the
Yeah,
box and say
yeah.
that I
So
can get
if
to the
you
next
want,
level.
yeah, but then that's fine. They've done the training, yeah, but you don't know if they've learned anything, and I think that drives me nuts, really. But I've also come to understand that not everybody's had the same journey as me. So
Yeah, absolutely. So the second question is, as technology continues to evolve, what future trends do you foresee impacting crisis response in cybersecurity?
it's interesting actually, because I'm doing a piece of academic research on digital leadership at the moment. So I've been finding out about all sorts of things around what makes leadership in a digital environment different to traditional leadership. And one of the most recent papers that I've seen is looking at AI and the fact it has a negative impact on our critical thinking skills. So by handing everything off to AI, we're having skills that we have to critically evaluate and reason are degrading. And that's happening at a time where things like deep fakes and everything, we need those skills. We need to be understanding, to be questioning things more. And yet the research is already showing that everybody goes to AI and we're going to stop using our brains because we think AI can do it all. So to me, I don't know if it's actually that new, because is the case always the case, isn't it? Technology, shiny gadgets, yeah, answer to everything. Human beings, not so much. So is it changing, or is it just becoming more that AI is going to be able to do more and impact on us in a way that technology hasn't done so far? I don't know. But yeah, something else for me to get across about, so that's fine.
Exactly. I was actually thinking this morning, there's that saying of not everything that glimmers is gold. Is that the right way to phrase it?
Yeah, very
And it
much.
and it feels almost like that's what AI is. It's like this whole glimmery, shiny, "Oh, let's take it on. Oh, it's kind of
Yeah,
let's engage with it." But actually there's other elements to it,
yeah,
both from a cybersecurity perspective, but also from a personal psychological perspective.
yeah. And I also think there's this sort of technology makes things more efficient, therefore we can save money and time and resources. There's also um, that aspect to it. But then, is it is there anything new? Really, it's just another form of shiny gadget coming in. Um, and I think also we probably overestimate what it can do. Um, I know people have these sort of thoughts around, oh, AI is taking over, it's going to take replace humans and all the rest of it. Um, and it may well do, but I think people don't realise that it's not there yet. It's nowhere near there yet. And I think what made me realise that is I took a picture of my son who's quite he's into yoga and things like that. So I asked AI to make me a cartoon of this picture of him sitting there with his legs crossed and his hands in this position on his knees. I could not get it to do this thing without giving him 4 feet. So if you cannot get AI to draw a human being and not give it more than 2 feet, where so that made me think actually maybe there's still some work to be done.
Yeah. I think you're right, is that a lot of people overestimate what AI can do and the potential of it. And I think even with, because a lot of people haven't necessarily used it yet and don't understand those limitations, they kind of take on board what the media tells them,
Yeah,
what the tech company tells them, and they go, oh, it's going to take my job. But actually, there are massive limitations at this point because it's just a large language model. It's
yeah.
not actually all that intelligent. It's
No,
just a predictive text or predictive model.
it is, yeah. And I think that I was doing this literature review. So out of interest, what I did was I did my traditional literature review in my academic way. I go to the journals and I do a keyword search and I find papers of interest, peer-reviewed journal papers, and then I read them and I make notes. So I've got a notes of what I was thinking while I was reading it. And then I did that for 5 papers, and then I popped those 5 papers into a Scholar GPT to see how their summary of the paper compared to mine, and they were very, very different. And again, the large language model is the large language model. It's looking at words and putting them together. And I can't articulate easily what the difference was, but I was not looking at just the words and how they matched together. I was understanding the links between the different topics and how one impacted on the other. And you just don't get that with AI. So I think that, yeah, that's my own research is telling me that it's
Yeah.
not
But
quite there yet.
but you've got all that experience behind you and you can make those links. It's kind of going back to the example of landing a plane on the Hudson, is
Yeah,
that unless you have that background, you don't necessarily see those links or where it's gone wrong and you can't explain it necessarily, but it's almost instinctive that doesn't quite work.
yes, yeah. And I think that's interesting for academia and AI because I was talking to a friend of mine who works for a university, and she was sort of very much of, oh no, you shouldn't be using AI to do literature reviews and that sort of thing. Well, your students are going to. So I think you need to get on board and actually give it a go yourself and see what it's capable of and how they're going to interpret things and how you can then instruct them to use AI in a way that is more positive, but learn about what the limitations are and to ask it the right questions in order to get what it needs. You can't just ignore these things that are coming up and look down your nose and go, no, that's cheating. It's just not on. You've got to engage with it to understand it, I think.
Exactly. It's about digital literacy, not just for those who are older, but
Yeah,
also for the students in terms of this is the positive use of AI, and actually this is where it falls, and
yeah,
you really need to, and this is
yeah,
how you learn or use AI in order to learn better
yeah.
rather than copy and
And maybe
paste.
that's how people develop the critical thinking skills is to learn to ask. Because I mean, I had to go and do a course in prompt generation because I just thought I need to engage with this. And for me, it's all about writing marketing stuff. My brain just doesn't work in that way. So I can put something quite academic in and it will take it out and make it fluffier. And that's great. And that for me is about an efficiency. It's not about doing the job for me. It's about supplementing my skills in a way that I can't. So yeah.
Yeah. I always use the example of we use Microsoft Word and PowerPoint and Excel to make our work more efficient. And that's kind of what AI is
Yeah.
potentially all about, is that making it more efficient rather than replacing what we do and how we think.
Yeah. Yeah. And an interesting thing, I can't think who told me this now. It was at a conference and we're having again this same conversation, and she turned around and she said it's like a mathematical calculator. You know, back in the, I don't know, any nine whatever, in the 90s, whatever, everybody got, you know, really these very complex calculators. And she said now you can get a mathematician who will use it to create some amazing things and do some very powerful calculations, or you get somebody like me who types in 55378808, 8008, turns it upside down, sniggers and said, "Ha, boobless." Do you know? So AI is the same. You know, it can be very good in the right hands, or you can be very clunky in people who don't actually know what they're doing. So yeah, I just thought that was quite a funny analogy that I came across.
I love that analogy. Yeah. It's
So I
awesome.
thought, yeah, that's me. So that's when I went off and did the
Yeah.
prompt engineering course and just thought, yeah, you need to engage a bit more with this.
Takes me back to school days,
Yeah,
giggling in the background.
yeah, exactly that. Yeah.
Final question is, do you have any particular favorite cyber psychology book that you normally recommend to others to read?
Now, I did have, but I've decided to approach this somewhat differently, because I think that cyber psychology books, I'm not sure there's a huge amount about, but there's two that I've got on my to read book. So I can't say I've read them, but I can't wait to get stuck in. So the first one is by Linda Kay. So you can find her on LinkedIn, and she's written The Psychology of Emoji Processing. So it's not my area of research at all, but I also know how much I use emojis and how much we rely on them to improve our communication to make sure our message isn't understood. So I'm dying to get stuck into that, because I just think out of interest, it's massively important, and the way we communicate has changed massively, even well from text messages onwards. So that's definitely one. Yeah. So the second book is by Amanda Widowson, and she's involved with the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors, and she's written a book called Humans and Cybersecurity: How Organisations Can Enhance Resilience Through Human Factors. So she's got all of the psychology and human factors background in there, and it looks utterly fabulous. So I think the premise is that actually it's easier to change organisational practices than it is to change individual behaviour. So, and she goes through and looks at all of the different behavioural motivations, vulnerabilities, all of that type of thing, and offers some practical advice in how to how to change behaviour in cybersecurity. So I'm really excited for that. Yeah, so pre-order, it's out on 28th, that's Monday, I think. So yeah, I should be expecting my Amazon delivery, and have put some time out on Tuesday afternoon to at least have a quick flick through.
Excellent. That's weekend reading coming up.
Yeah.
Beck, thank you so much for joining me at Confessions of a Cyber Psychologist. It was fabulous to catch up with you, and I really look forward to chatting to you again in the future.
Great. Thanks so much for asking me. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.